Silence blanketed the war room as the conquest of the Frost Giant's citadel reached its conclusion. Ilishnish thought that the downfall of the Frost Dragon's rivals was a generally good thing, but the atmosphere gave her the impression that the others were not pleased with the results. She could not read the expressions of Lord Cocytus and his insectoid vassals, but the 5 dwarves seated across from Ilishnish harbored expressions that ranged from grim to aghast. The force sent by the Sorceress Kingdom consisted of 50 Death Knights, 10 Death Warriors and 5 Elder Liches. Their total losses amounted to 17 Death Knights, 4 Death Warriors and 3 Elder Liches. The vast majority of those losses were not the result of being slain in direct combat, but from the hazards that came with storming the citadel. Once it was clear that they would be overwhelmed in a direct confrontation, the Frost Giant defenders changed their tactics. All but 3 of the Death Knights that had been lost were sent plummeting off of the side of the mountain, a sheer drop of well over 1,000 meters. The Death Knight's last resort ability, which allowed them to survive a single instance of fatal damage, did not help them, as they struck the cliff face multiple times on the way down. 2 of the Elder Liches, including the one they had sent to declare their intent, had been destroyed by boulders. The third met its end when an unexpectedly strong group of Frost Giants was encountered after the attackers spread out over the vast interior of the citadel. This group had gone on to smash into the reserves that were brought in to help clean up, decimating them even as they themselves perished. Only 4 Death Knights and the Elder Lich remained out of what had originally been a full contingent of 10 Death Knights, 2 Death Warriors, and the Elder Lich commander. The sight of the group's last Frost Giant hurling himself off of the mountain clutching a Death Knight and Death Warrior in either hand was still fresh in their minds. Of the defenders, none had survived. Roughly a quarter of them had been turned into squire zombies by the Death Knights, while the rest of the corpses were slowly dragged away. The 2 surviving Elder Liches were now making a study of the citadel and its contents in an effort to devise new tactics for the next assault. Savage barbarians, Lord Cocytus muttered, or proud warriors. Many contrasts, difficult to tell. You're right, the commander-in-chief said. Half of the time I couldn't tell courage from desperation, but it was pretty clear who the cowards were. Ilishnish couldn't understand why it mattered. Whether they were courageous, desperate, or craven, they were dead all the same. That the members of the War Council bothered trying to differentiate between them felt a pointless exercise. The bunch that retreated from the gate should have been the Jarl and his housecarls. One of the dwarven aides looked up from an open tome on the table. The chew-and-plate mail that stuck close to him were probably his blackguards. A right bastard, that one, the commander-in-chief spat. He abandoned his defenders at the gate, then he sent his villagers out to fight after he ran out of warriors. The histories say that there are warrior people, but if they had someone like that leading them. A door silence stretched on for several moments. The dwarf commander-in-chief drummed his fingers briefly against the table before rising to his feet. We should take a brief recess while we can, he said as he looked over at Lord Cocytus. How long will it be until the other groups reach their targets? 2 hours for the citadel in the west, one of the insectoid vassals replied. 4 for the north. In that case, the commander-in-chief said, we'll be headed out for lunch if that's all right with you. Lord Cocytus nodded slightly, waving them away with one of his left claws. The dwarves filed out of the room, save for the representative from the Merchant Guild. The young dwarf, he couldn't have been older than Ilishnish, shifted uncomfortably before visibly working up the courage to speak. If you'd like, he licked his lips, I can have refreshments delivered to you here. A meal, even. Is that what he's here for? To offer hospitality? It seemed a silly reason to have someone attend the council for hours on end. Or perhaps it was an excuse to garner a sense of importance for the Merchant Guild. Lord Cocytus and his vassals exchanged glances, then turned to look at Ilishnish. Did they want her to order something? She turned her attention to the dwarf. Some meat would be delightful, she told him. The dwarf flinched at the word meat, glancing nervously at Lord Cocytus and his vassals. Meat? Cold cuts or the like, Ilishnish said. Nothing hot, please. With one last glance at Lord Cocytus, the dwarf scampered off after his fellows. The door shut quietly behind him, leaving them alone in the silence. Ilishnish stared down at the map, eyeing the markers that indicated the progress of the 2 advancing detachments. Unexpected. A blast of cold air followed Lord Cocytus' statement, frosting over the edge of the table. The vassal nearest to him, a short, brown-shelled being whose eyes glowed from within the shadows of its carapace, stirred. Your servant submits that we send 3 more infantry contingents to each of the remaining groups. Do you want to solve this with brute force? Another vassal spoke, Lord Cocytus. Your servant submits that we instead settle in for a siege. That might solve the terrain issues, said another, but we don't know how long they can last. What if the main army in the south moves? That's why we left most of our forces to guard against them. A fight on the open field is to our advantage should they decide to attack. The back and forth went on for several minutes. Elishnish watched them silently, uncertain of the problem. The frost giants had died, and the sorceress kingdom's losses were but a tiny fraction of the undead servitors at its disposal. Why couldn't they just win the same way and be done with it? Another blast of cold air from Lord Cocytus stilled their rising voices. With a siege, victory, I have no doubts. Our purpose, however, to gain experience. This scenario, its issues, challenges. In the future, they will appear again. Our tactics, they must be refined. The discussion resumed, all thoughts of a siege abandoned without a word of opposition. Elishnish wondered why it was a thing in the first place. She could not tell how old they were, but they were all presumably adults of various heteromorphic races. The sorceress kingdom was ruled by an undead sovereign and filled with all manner of immortal beings. Surely, in their long lives, they had fought in similar situations before. Elishnish had only observed their society for a few months, but even she understood that those in positions of authority tended to have extensive amounts of relevant experience. Our problem right now is that the soldiers aren't trained for this, an ant-like vassal in a black carapace said. They've been on standby since being created. Then what about the ones that received training in the south? The brown-shelled vassal asked. It's not the same terrain, the ant-like vassal answered, and the nature of their exercises was different from what we're doing here, anyway. But the commanders from those contingents might be useful. The ant-like vassal shook its head, antennae waving lightly back and forth. I agree, but we shouldn't risk that. The elder liches are extremely vulnerable against these frost giants. It would be a waste to lose experienced commanders. A knock sounded from the door, and the room quieted down. Elishnish was subjected to everyone's gaze again. What am I, a maid? Despite her thoughts, she retained her poise as she went to answer. In the hallway, she discovered 3 dwarves pushing covered carts. Behind them, the Merchant Guild representative hovered about nervously. Elishnish led them inside, where they left the carts along the wall, uncovering them to reveal ornately arranged arrays of sliced meats. The tantalizing aroma reminded Elishnish that she hadn't eaten in the past week. She turned to address the pale-faced dwarves who were awaiting by their carts. Thank you very much, she smiled. You may leave these here with us. The dwarves sent tentative looks in the direction of the Merchant Guild representative, who gestured for them to come away. Elishnish heard them issue sighs of relief just before the door to the hall closed again. Taking an empty plate, Elishnish piled it high with slices of sausage, cuts of cured meat and cold roasts slathered in savory sauces. She returned to the table to find that no one else had moved. Is no one else having any? She asked. Lord Cocytus and his vassals shook their heads. That was fine with her, she had plenty of room for everything, or at least she thought she did. She wasn't exactly sure how it worked. Elishnish placed her plate down on the table and popped a piece of sausage into her mouth. Staring down at the plate as she enjoyed the morsel, she decided to move it to the far side of herself just to be safe. They might have declined, but she didn't know if the insectoid vassal beside her would try and filch something anyway. One of Cocytus' vassals updated the markers on the map before their discussion resumed again. These issues will be present with every new undead servitor that enters the army, the brown-shelled vassal said. Proper training can be developed in time, but they are still not very flexible. Not every situation is the same. The answer should lie with our commanders, a vassal in a segmented green carapace said. With enough time, the elder liches can. With respect, the ant-like vassal interrupted, time is our enemy. Elder liches are not invincible, and it is inevitable that we will lose them in the vast span of time. Be it in 1,000 years or 10,000 years, all it takes is a single unexpected situation or a strong opponent that selectively destroys them. Imagine a commander with 10,000 years of experience being lost. It would be a travesty. Their discussion fell silent for several moments at the notion. The vassal with the green carapace crossed two pairs of arms, staring at the map on the table. "So you're saying we should select stronger commanders?" it asked. "In that case, Crypt Lords would be the obvious choice." "The problem is the same," the ant-like vassal shook its head. "I admit that the vast majority of the opponents we've encountered so far have been weak, but our reports speak of powerful beings that lie beyond. Lord Cocytus has done battle with one such foe already, and even Lady Sheltier was brought low by a hidden hand." Elishnish looked up from her meal curiously. Someone had managed to defeat Lady Sheltier in the past? Was it even possible? Perhaps she had crossed paths with one of the fabled dragon lords of old. "That's true," the brown-shelled vassal sighed. "But if we frame it in those terms, elder liches clearly become the best option. They are numerous enough to be expendable, and His Majesty raises more every day. We just need to ensure that we always have sufficient commanders trained and ready to replace our losses." "I agree, our powerful servitors are invaluable and we cannot afford to lose them," the green-shelled vassal said, then sighed as well. "If only there was a way to revive them." Murmurs of agreement rose from the other vassals. They appeared to have settled on the fact that they would inevitably lose experienced personnel. Lord Cocytus raised a claw to rub his head, chuckling ruefully. "Sheltier," he said, "has pulled ahead." Lord Cocytus' vassals turned their heads towards him in unison. "My lord?" "The problem," he said. "Powerful servants cannot be risked. The weak inevitably lost. Sheltier, to the outside, she has turned. Enlisted others. Your servant agrees that her method has merits," the ant-like vassal nodded thoughtfully. "In doing so, she does not risk any of ours. They can also be revived with their knowledge and expertise intact." "But Lady Sheltier heads the Ministry of Transportation." The brown-shelled vassal placed its arms on the table and leaned forward. "My lord proposes that we begin inducting the citizenry into the army, but is it viable? The people are uneducated, most of them can't even read. Never mind training, even trust is not a given, they are not our own. In addition, there is no military tradition in this land like what they have in the Empire. How many generations will this take? As far as I know, no one has raised." The ardor of the brown-shelled vassal diminished with some realization unknown to Elishnish, and Lord Cocytus let out a brusque snort. "Indeed," he said. "The army of the Sorceress Kingdom. Its creation, our task. But Sheltier has stolen a march on us. Before we were even aware of the problem, she has found a solution. A commander, she has already raised. One who always returns." Ludmilla opened her eyes and was greeted by a wall of white. A wall of white, and a smell. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to sort her scrambled senses. Fingers and toes, arms and legs, something was pressing down on her legs. Looking down, or was it up? The sight of a giant, armored black pauldron brought recent events flooding back to the forefront of her mind. The concussion arrows had succeeded in bringing an avalanche down on their heads. Though it was clear that no one would be able to escape, they weren't quite done yet. Ludmilla dashed behind the armored frost giants, Sigurd's legs as the torrent of ice and other debris smashed into them. Her gamble paid off. Sigurd activated Invulnerable Fortress to withstand the initial impact. Ludmilla activated Fortress a moment before the giant's defensive art expired. After that, nothing. The mountain was unimpressed by their defiant bid for survival and crushed them anyway. How much time had passed since then? The frost giant's ravaged corpse had apparently sheltered her from the worst of the avalanche. There was even a large hollow left in its wake. Her elemental protection prevented her from freezing, and the ring of sustenance kept hunger at bay. She briefly imagined emerging from the ice, only to discover that years had passed. No, the fresh stench of death would have long dissipated if that was the case. Though it might actually happen if I can't get out from under this corpse. She tested the weight of the shoulder over her legs. Platinum rank physical combatants were far stronger than the average human being, but the giant probably weighed 4 or 5 tons, more, considering there was a suit of full plate mail. In attempting to move her legs, she shifted the giant upwards a bit. Thankfully, the joints of Sigurd's armor were flexible enough for her to manipulate. Ludmilla activated Ability Boost and edged out from under the corpse bit by bit. In a few minutes, she was free. The hollow she was stuck in stood barely a meter high, and she went about on her hands and knees trying to find traces of fresh air. There were a few cracks in the jumble of ice and stone, but none were large enough for her to crawl out of. She turned back around to examine the portion of Sigurd's corpse sticking out of the debris and considered her options. There were dozens of glass arrows in her infinite haversack, with plenty of fire and concussion arrows amongst them. However, she doubted that there was enough to melt or blast her way out. She wasn't even certain how deeply she was buried, but there was an oppressive feeling to her surroundings that suggested that it wasn't just a few meters to freedom. With enough time, she could probably dig her way out with Lady Schulte's glaive. The weapon had proven that it could slice through mundane materials with ease. Then there was Sigurd. Such a powerful opponent probably had more than a few magic items. At the least, there was whatever was conferring the freedom effect when she had tried to stall him with tanglefoot arrows. Ludmilla wasn't sure to what extent it would work, but if being stuck in ice was considered a movement restriction, she might be able to just walk out. She crept over to his right hand and struggled to work off his metal gauntlet. There were no rings on his fingers, nor any sign of a bracelet. After removing her own, she stuck her hand into the giant's gauntlet. Nothing happened. It wasn't a magic item, else it would have shrunk to fit her. Ludmilla crawled over Sigurd's arm to check his waist. There was a belt, but she couldn't tell what it was, or if it was enchanted at all. The corpse was also buried in such a way that only his right shoulder and head stuck out, so she couldn't get it off. She couldn't recall if he had any pouches, but none were exposed to her. Frowning, she went back to Sigurd's head to check for accessories. His helmet looked about as plain as his gauntlet, and she couldn't see if there were any earrings under it. The cowl that was wrapped around his shoulders looked like it could be removed, as well as the dull metal chain around his neck. Ludmilla unclasped the cowl and slowly tugged it out from under him. When she moved to equip it, the black fabric tightened and shrunk to fit her. She didn't feel herself change in any way, so it probably did not augment her physical attributes. Aside from that, she had no idea what it did. The necklace was adorned with a single polished tooth. It, too, adjusted in size when she moved to put it on. She looked down at the tooth again. It had originally been so large that Ludmilla thought it could only be from a dragon or some other giant creature. Now, it looked like a fang that might have come from any number of carnivores. As with the cowl, she felt nothing change upon equipping it. Reaching into her infinite haversack, Ludmilla broke open a tanglefoot arrow and spilt its contents into a corner. She dipped her finger into the alchemical glue, then pulled it away just as easily. Removing the necklace, she tried it again with the same result. After removing the cowl, her finger became stuck. She awkwardly re-equipped the cowl with her free hand and freed her finger. Taking a deep breath, Ludmilla crawled forward into the nearby wall. She ended up with a face full of ice. As she brushed it off, she decided that the idea was probably a bit too optimistic. Without knowing what the tooth necklace did, she decided to leave her lesser amulet of natural armor equipped. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out an extra globe of magical dye, recoloring the cowl to match the rest of her equipment. She checked over the exposed portions of the corpse one last time, then called her glaive to hand. With great shame over the fact that she was using such an excellent weapon as a digging implement, Ludmilla tentatively started to scrape at the ceiling. After a minute, something came loose and a great amount of snow and debris tumbled from the ceiling. Ludmilla scrambled away, hoping that she hadn't buried herself. Eventually, it stopped. She pushed as much as she could into an unused part of the hollow. The portion that had fallen left a space where she could stand. There still wasn't any sign of the surface, but at least it was now easier to move around. She tried to figure out the orientation of the mountain slope as best as she could, then set about clearing a way out. Minutes, then hours passed as Ludmilla slowly tunneled up a moderate incline. Every once in a while, the ceiling gave way and she could only press herself against the ice, letting the debris tumble past her. Once she settled into an admittedly haphazard routine, her thoughts turned to the fate of the expedition. Had they been able to escape? She wasn't sure how many frost giants were nearby when she brought the mountain tumbling down on their heads, but it was likely that they had split up to go down either side of the glacier. Given the rate at which the giants advanced, the expedition's best chance of escape would have been to go down into the gorge below where they could avoid the worst of the storm. With Fiorizzo so close, however, the temptation to flee to the deceptively close promise of safety may have been too great. If that was the case, then they were probably all dead. Not knowing how much time had passed was also a problem for Ludmilla. If her timing was really bad, she would surface just as the frost giants were returning from their ambush. If she had been buried for too long, a vast number of the undead might be waiting for her. The lesser undead were not a problem for her, but there had been so many undead on the glacier and in the past that she was certain stronger ones could manifest. The ceiling started to collapse again, and Ludmilla waited as chunks of ice and stone bounced off of her armor. A persistent moan filled the air. She had broken through to the surface. What greeted her was not giants or the undead, however, but the howling winds of a mountain storm. She looked over the edge of the opening, peering into the surroundings. Beyond 100 meters, her vision was completely obscured. What she could see was not much different. The ground was littered with the leavings from the avalanche and layered in snow, creating a speckled field of dirty white. There was no sign of giants or any undead, but it didn't mean much when she could only see so far. Ludmilla lowered herself back down, hoping that no one would notice the hole that she had emerged from. It would be better to wait out the storm and make her escape when visibility was improved. Surviving, only to be killed by a boulder from an unseen giant was the last thing she wanted. She withdrew an extra bow stave from her infinite haversack. The longbow that she carried previously could not be found, and strung it, testing its pull as she waited for the storm to pass. Several hours went by. A shudder sent rivulets of loose powder down from above. Another shudder followed, then more in steady cadence. Something large was moving around nearby. The steps came closer, then stopped. Ludmilla dared not go up again to peek outside. After a while, the steps resumed, then stopped again several moments later. They traveled a ways, increasing in intensity, then fading away again. Ludmilla edged deeper into her tunnel. Had she been spotted? The pacing above might be a frost giant searching the area, periodically stopping to look around for places where she might be hidden. Ludmilla waited quietly as it continued to move about. Eventually, the steps receded into the distance. Ludmilla carefully crept back up and looked around. It was still snowing, but the storm looked to have finally passed. With the much improved visibility, she stared wide-eyed over the landscape. The avalanche had deposited her a third of the way down the glacial valley, but it had continued to run its course from there. A vast field of debris stretched out along the length of the moraine, scouring away whatever undead might have remained there. As she continued to look around, Ludmilla found the giant that had walked away. It was far stronger than she was, about as strong as the huntress that had accompanied Sigurd. The way it carried itself, however, did not match the gait of a warrior or a huntress. Pulling herself out of the tunnel, Ludmilla stalked after it to get a better look. As she closed the distance, she could identify strings of feathers and bones hanging from the giant's garb. Multiple satchels hung from its belt. It carried a short, if 6 meters could be called short, spear in one hand, using it as a walking stick. Several fetishes and other oddities hung from below the spear blade. The giant slowly made its way up the glacier, its shock of long, frost-white hair whipping in the wind. It was seemingly oblivious to any dangers that might be nearby, and Ludmilla considered the possible opportunity. Though much larger than the demi-humans she was familiar with, this giant's garb marked it as some sort of mystic. According to Elishnish, it was possible to speak to one depending on the circumstances. Ludmilla looked over her shoulder, in the direction of Fiorizo. The Adventurer Guild continued to have issues with the frost giants without any opportunity for civilized diplomacy. Heading to the dwarf city would mean her personal safety, but it would produce no gains for the sorceress kingdom. Looking back ahead of her, she continued following the frost giant. Their trek brought her to the crest of the glacier, revealing a field of ice and snow that stretched beyond her sight. Craggy peaks broke out from the frozen crown of the Azalisia Mountains, creating a pristine and ancient landscape that was both breathtaking and alien at the same time. A place where humans could never dwell and only a fortunate, or unfortunate, few would lay their eyes on. The giant turned and headed towards some sort of shelter nestled against the side of the nearby peak. As it approached the entrance, Ludmilla called out to it. "Excuse me." The frost giant turned in Ludmilla's direction, spear brandished. A face with chiseled, yet feminine features looked about until the giant lowered her gaze towards her. The angle of the spear lowered, and the giant furrowed her brow. "Hobgoblin?" "Human," Ludmilla corrected her. "I am Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik of the Sorceress Kingdom." For some reason, the head of the spear wavered when the word Baroness left her mouth. "What is your purpose here, Baroness?" I was here with the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild, Ludmilla said, but our attempts at diplomacy with your people have been dismal, at best. I was hoping I could speak with you. Diplomacy, the Frost Giant snorted. Wait, was that your doing down there? If you mean the avalanche, yes, Ludmilla replied. I encountered 4 of your people, at least. 2 went by the names of Sigurd and Brunhild. A wave of hostility washed over Ludmilla. She tensed, ready to dart away if the Frost Giant charged her. If she started casting spells, Ludmilla would plant a fire arrow in her face. Brunhild was my closest friend, the Frost Giant narrowed her eyes. Sigurd was my husband. Are you saying that you killed them? I am. The sense of hostility reached a crushing intensity. Face twitching, the Frost Giant glared down at her. Then, all at once, the hostility vanished. The giant returned her spear to an upright position. Then I have been rude, she lowered her head. I hope you will forgive my breach of proper conduct. I am called Gudrun. Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik, you have earned your welcome in this place. The interior of Gudrun's dwelling was nearly as bare as the face of the mountain looming over it. Its 4 walls were made from ice, and supplies were lined along one side. What appeared to be beddings formed from piles of furs filled the back. Unlike the dwellings of other demi-humans, no fire pit could be found. Gudrun ushered her in before replacing the slab over the entrance. It fit poorly, though with frost giants being immune to cold, Ludmilla supposed that all they required was to keep the wind and blowing snows from making a mess of the place. Using one of the furs stacked nearby, Gudrun swatted a section of packed ice clear of loose powder before throwing the fur on the floor. Is that my seat? As if to answer her unspoken question, the giant gestured to the fur before seating herself. The customs of your kind are unknown to us, Gudrun's voice reverberated off of the icy walls. I would also offer you hospitality, but I have heard that humans do not prepare their meals in the same way as my kind. With Ludmilla's first impression of the frost giant still fresh in her mind, Gudrun's behavior struck a stark contrast. Offering a meal, be it in a home or at a campfire, was a cultural practice that expressed the host's desire to welcome a guest. It was common amongst humans, and it seemed that some demi-humans enacted such behaviors as well. Your people have never encountered humans before? The idea had not occurred to her. Ludmilla lived in a place where demi-humans lived in tribes along the frontier, and she always thought that she was the one who saw races that she had only ever heard of or were completely unknown. The recent invasion of the upper reaches brought a new race with it, but members of that race did not seem surprised at the existence of a human. More than that, they all seemed to view her with hostility, indicating a history with her kind. According to the temples, humans were on the verge of extinction before the arrival of the 6 great gods. There were tales of places that raised humans as chattel, but it shouldn't be a surprise that there were also places where humans were entirely unknown. A long time ago, Gudrun replied, the tribes to the north raided those traveling in and out of the dwarf kingdom. The tales tell of a race similar to hobgoblins in size and wit, though they mentioned nothing of your habits. If you're more familiar with the dwarves, Ludmilla said, the sorceress kingdom exports food to their nation. Her voice trailed off. Trade with the dwarves also brought dwarven cuisine, but she couldn't say that their food was exactly the same, or even edible by humans. The dwarf bread she had sent her maids out to purchase was essentially a loaf of baked gravel and now served as a doorstop. Exports. Gudrun seemed to struggle with the word. We sent food to the dwarf kingdom. Then something like a tribute. The giant grew even more confused at her description. Do your people not trade between yourselves? Ludmilla asked, exchange goods and services, I mean. Gudrun furrowed her brow at her question, then slowly nodded. Yes, she said, we do practice trade within our own tribes. But not with other tribes? No, Gudrun replied, there is no need. Every tribe is responsible for its own well-being. Ludmilla fell silent for several moments, reframing how she would have to go about speaking to Gudrun. The frost giants were a powerful, self-sufficient warrior race. They were so insular that even fellow tribes did not conduct trade. How did they interact? What sort of culture bound them together? Or was it only strength and violence that dictated order? If your people do not trade, Ludmilla asked, then how did you come to hear of these tales from the other tribes? Once in a while, Gudrun answered, we send warriors that seek to prove themselves or become curious about outsiders. These warriors are the ones that return with the tales from the north, though it is sometimes difficult to pick out the truth from some of the more boastful accounts. What else do these tales say about humans? They speak of strange plunder and little in the way of prowess. Those strong enough to challenge our raiders are rare, and those powerful enough to defeat our champions are unheard of. Ludmilla frowned as their conversation turned to matters of violence once again. Tribute, raids, the recognition of martial prowess, everything revolved around the exercise of strength. Frontier nobles were often considered men and women who came from a martial tradition, but martial matters were only a part of her life. Frost giant culture, on the other hand, seemed to focus on it. Is strength the only thing that your people respect? Of course not. Gudrun shifted in her seat. Honor may be found in many things, but, to all things, there is an order. Strength stands at the pinnacle of order, for order cannot be maintained without strength. This, at least, made perfect sense to Ludmilla. It was strange that even an isolated demi-human tribe understood this basic truth when the supposedly civilized nobles of her former nation of Riastais did not. Without strength, all else could be stolen away by someone stronger. The service of frontier houses like their own, the unnoticed intervention of the theocracy's scriptures, the mostly peaceful interactions with their neighbors. All these, combined with the legal structure of the kingdom's administration, led to the rise of a culture mired in complacency and ignorance. Compliance was considered peace. Numbers were seen as strength. Wealth was mistaken for prosperity. In the worst cases, nobles followed the path of House Fassett, turning their delusions into a nightmarish reality. Ludmilla couldn't be certain just how far things had progressed in the rest of Riastais. It couldn't be that terrible everywhere, considering the country hadn't imploded yet, but things were certain to grow worse until something changed. Rather than capitalizing on their advantageous situation, the nation had, by many accounts, fallen into decadence and corruption. Ilishnish's scathing retort about human civilization and the primitive tribal societies of demi-humans echoed in her mind. As Gudrun had stated, strength was required to maintain order. The frost giants might have existed for countless ages under the unbreakable rule of their strength. Human society, however, seemed like it fell away from that maxim. Frontier nobles were required to pioneer new lands and defend borders, but progress and development led to their decline. In their place were civilian nobles who were incapable of defending their lands from both external and internal threats. The theocracy had ceded the northern kingdoms in the hope that they would bear fruit for humanity, but what had grown instead were nations ripe for the taking. If the efforts of the scriptures faltered, the doom of humanity was assured. But then the Sorceress Kingdom appeared. As a representative of the Sorceress Kingdom, Ludmilla said, "I would like to gain some insight on your people. How are your tribes ordered? Are there castes or some similar hierarchy?" "We are ordered in threes," Gudrun said. "Threes?" "Yes," Gudrun nodded, "threes. The number 3 is sacred to our people, as is 9, 3 sets of 3. There are 3 castes, warrior, priest, and worker, who each see to their own ways. Every steading has 3 longhouses, and every village has 3 steadings. Each village is ruled by a baron, and 3 barons answer to an earl, who rules the tribe from his citadel. There are 3 tribes for each of the 3 regions of the Azalisia Mountains, 9 tribes after the 9 realms of our law." It was a lot of threes, but it did make things easy to remember. "Wait, this isn't your home?" "This is a supply depot." Ludmilla turned her gaze away in embarrassment. The savage nature of the frost giants that she had been exposed to had set her expectations unreasonably low. In hindsight, there was no way a race capable of smithing armor and weapons dwelled so simply. She wondered if she would be able to see what their homes were like. "You mentioned 9 realms," Ludmilla said. "Does that mean that there are other places in the world with frost giants?" "There are," Gudrun told her. "Our people are not native to this place. The name of where we came from has been lost to time, but we do know that our ancestors sailed here from over the seas. The tribes of the north still retain the knowledge of crafting our longships and nares, though the dragons have long destroyed our once mighty fleet." "Nah." It was the same word that Lady Shiltir used for the ship used by Warden's Vale. Was it possible that frost giants once lived in the southern border ranges? It would explain why the same type of vessel was found there. More to the point, she had inadvertently come across potential shipbuilders in the middle of a mountain range. "Is there someone who rules over the 9 tribes? A king, or someone similar?" "We have no king," Gudrun replied. It is not impossible, however. I encouraged Sigurd to unify the tribes once in a while, to little result. He was strong, but he had no interest in rule. Then if the Sorceress Kingdom were to speak to everyone, how would that be accomplished? You would need to make the tribes listen, one by one. Did that mean she would have to kill scores of powerful frost giants just to make everyone pay attention to what she had to say? She had a feeling that burying everyone in an avalanche would only work once. This Sigurd, how did he fit into the structure of your tribe? Sigurd was one of the champions of the tribe, a leader of his own warband. I think he would have preferred staying that way, but he ended up fancying me. What was the problem with that? You both seem quite strong. Because we are not of the same caste, Gudrun explained. My father forbade the union and implored the Baron at the time to uphold our ways. Sigurd, of course, thrashed the Baron. In doing so, he became the new Baron and was stuck with the position ever since. Gudrun chuckled at some memory only she could see, but Ludmilla frowned at the account. When the giant had spoken of earls and barons, Ludmilla had equated it to human systems of nobility. Rather than titles being inherited, however, it appeared that one could just bludgeon their way to the top. It also meant that Sigurd was probably about as strong as frost giants became if he could aspire to kingship. Then by defeating Sigurd, Ludmilla asked, who will listen to me? The entire village, at least, Gudrun answered. He was a great champion, so the whole of the Frost Reaver tribe would at least listen to what you have to say. What of the other tribes? They are their own tribes, the giant shrugged. Meaning to say, she would have to defeat the champions of every frost giant tribe just to have them listen. Or would that make her their queen? Either way, it was almost certainly impossible for her. With this information, however, the Adventurer Guild might be able to field Moman or Nobbe to accomplish the feat. Is there some other way? Ludmilla asked. As a shaman, can you speak through other shamans? Shamans are respected wherever we go, Gudrun answered, even those of other races. However, it is not the same sort of respect as that which is won through a warrior's challenge. It is respect for the role that we play in our tribes. Then is there anything at all that I can do? I do not even know what it is you want, Baroness. It occurred to Ludmilla that, beyond her introduction, she had said nothing of herself at all. She just kept asking for information, aggressively looking for a way through. As was the case with many things that civilian nobles were normally skilled at, she was a horrible diplomat. If one of her friends were here, the problem might have already been well on its way towards resolution. If they had someone to fight for them, that was. My apologies, Ludmilla said. In addition to extending its rule over the Great Forest of Tob, the Sorceress Kingdom has recently entered into diplomatic relations with the Dwarf Kingdom under the mountains here, in addition to establishing trade ties. The Frost Dragons and the Quagga were subjugated in the process, and the Frost Giants are the only remaining power of note. I have heard that the Frost Dragons have a new master, Gudrun said. So, what is it that you want with us? 2 of our survey expeditions have been attacked so far, Ludmilla told her, and your people have a reputation for raiding. The Sorceress Kingdom has been deliberating over what should be done with the threat to their trade. In that case, I would suggest war. Ludmilla blinked several times at the immediate answer. War was usually not the first resort in diplomacy. There's truly no other way? I believe that my nation would prefer a peaceful solution. Gudrun snorted, looking down at her in amusement. Peace was never an option, she said, and war is the most straightforward way to settle a contest of strength with all of our tribes. But your people will die. All things must die, Gudrun told her. Giants, dragons, humans. Even the fate of the gods is known. I have seen this before, human, how lowlanders seem to believe that simply being alive or dead is all that matters. But simply being alive has no meaning. It is how one lives and how one dies that truly means anything, and to fall in honorable combat is the greatest of ends.